The diner stood like a relic of the past, perched on the edge of a busy highway. Its neon signs flickered defiantly against time, a beacon for truckers, weary travelers, and locals seeking the comfort of nostalgia. The red leather booths, polished chrome accents, and the soft hum of an old jukebox playing tunes from decades past added to its charm. The air carried the rich aroma of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee, blending seamlessly with the clatter of dishes and murmured conversations. Behind the counter, a waitress with kind but tired eyes wiped down a stack of coffee cups, exchanging friendly banter with a trucker finishing his plate of scrambled eggs and toast. In a corner booth, a young family laughed over a shared milkshake, while at another table, three teenagers scrolled through their phones, occasionally chuckling at something on their screens. It was an ordinary afternoon, quiet yet vibrant in its own way. For some, like Miss Eleanor, this diner was more than a pit stop. It was a sanctuary. She stepped inside, her slight frame wrapped in a colorful cardigan. Adjusting her hat, she smiled at the waitress who greeted her warmly. "Good afternoon, ma'am." The usual spot. Eleanor nodded and made her way to her favorite booth by the window. She was a dignified woman in her 70s, carrying herself with a grace that spoke of a life filled with trials, yet met with unwavering resilience. Her brown leather purse hung neatly from her shoulder as she slid into the booth, placing it beside her with careful precision. She had just returned from visiting her grandchildren, a trip that filled her heart with joy but left her body tired from the long bus ride home. Her order was always the same: a cup of Earl Grey tea and a slice of peach pie. As she waited, she gazed out the window at the never-ending ribbon of highway stretching into the horizon. A deep sense of contentment filled her. This diner, this moment, was part of a cherished routine, a small comfort in a world that seemed to change too fast. Unbeknownst to most, in a shadowed corner of the diner, sat a man who carried his own presence: Jack Carter, a retired heavyweight boxing champion. He was hunched over his meal, clad in a gray tracksuit, hood pulled low over his face. A hamburger rested in his hands, but he chewed thoughtfully, lost in the rare moment of solitude. Places like this offered him a retreat from the constant buzz of the outside world. Here, he could simply exist, free from the weight of fame and expectation. Despite his effort to blend in, Jack had always been an observant man, his instincts sharpened by years in the ring. His eyes flicked toward the elderly woman by the window. There was something familiar about the quiet confidence in her posture, a strength that reminded him of his mother, who had carried herself with similar resilience in the face of hardship. The afternoon unfolded peacefully, the usual din of conversation and clinking dishes filling the air. The waitress brought Eleanor her tea and pie, placing them on the table with a warm smile. "Enjoy, ma'am." "Thank you, dear," Eleanor replied, her voice soft yet strong. She lifted her teacup, savoring the warmth, unaware that outside the diner, trouble was approaching. The bell above the door jangled sharply, announcing new arrivals. The shift in atmosphere was almost imperceptible at first, but a trained eye like Jack's picked up on it immediately. For men strode in, their heavy boots thudding against the floor, their presence immediately commanding attention. Dressed in worn leather jackets adorned with insignias, they exuded a mix of arrogance and intimidation. Their leader, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his cheek, scanned the room with an air of entitlement. His name was Wade Turner, and he moved like he owned every space he entered. Behind him, his companions followed, their movements slightly less assured but no less menacing. They made their way to a central booth, their loud voices slicing through the previously serene atmosphere. Conversations quieted, and the waitress hesitated before approaching their table. The family with young children exchanged uneasy glances, while the teenagers put their phones down, sensing the shift in energy. Eleanor, absorbed in her tea, barely noticed the new arrivals at first. But as Wade's voice boomed through the diner, she couldn't help but glance in their direction. Her gaze met his sneering smile. "Well, look at that," Wade drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "We've got ourselves a queen over there by the window." Laughter erupted from his crew, a cruel, unsettling sound that made the other patrons shift uncomfortably in their seats. Eleanor, however, remained composed. She turned her gaze back to her tea as if she hadn't heard him. In his corner booth, Jack Carter lifted his head slightly. Years of surviving both in and out of the ring had honed his instincts, and they told him this wasn't going to end well. He didn't move yet, just watched, waiting. Wade leaned back in his seat, stretching his arms across the booth. "What's the matter, Grandma? Too good to look at me." Eleanor didn't respond. Her hands remained steady as she lifted her cup, taking a slow sip. This wasn't her first time dealing with men like Wade. She knew better than to give him the reaction he wanted. The tension in the diner thickened. Conversations had all but disappeared. The waitress stood frozen behind the counter, her hands gripping a tray as she debated whether to intervene. The other patrons kept their eyes averted, unwilling to draw attention to themselves. Wade's smirk faltered as he realized he was being ignored. Annoyance flickered in his expression. He slammed his hand down on the table, making the dishes rattle. The sudden noise drew startled gasps from a few customers. Eleanor finally looked up, her expression calm but firm. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "I don't believe we've been introduced, young man. If you'll excuse me, I'd like to finish my tea in peace." The tension in the room deepened. Jack's hands curled into loose fists as he watched the exchange. He wasn't sure yet if he'd need to step in, but he was ready. Wade chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You got some nerve, lady. Don't you know who you're talking to?" Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "I know exactly who I'm talking to. Someone who thinks making a scene makes him important." The room seemed to hold its breath. Jack's eyes narrowed as he studied Wade's reaction. The biker's face darkened, and his hand twitched as if ready to reach for something. Jack had seen enough. Slowly, he rose from his booth, moving with the deliberate grace of a man who knew how to handle trouble. "That's enough," Jack said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Wade turned, startled by the interruption. His eyes raked over Jack, sizing him up. "And who the hell are you?" Jack's gaze was steady, unwavering. "Just a guy telling you to leave her alone." The room was dead silent. Even Wade's friends shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jack didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone was enough. For the first time, Wade hesitated. His bravado wavered as he looked into the face of a man who had nothing to prove, but everything to back it up. And for the first time in a long time, Wade Turner made the smart choice. He backed down, continued,